I had other plans for today. I was not expecting to make this video, but this came up on my radar on the internet, and I literally could not stop myself from delving into it, and I have to tell you guys all about it. So you might have seen screenshots of this article getting posted around. It's got a pretty inflammatory title, and it is locked behind a paywall, which is very annoying. But first things first, I want to tell you, you can read the study that this article is talking about for free. I will link it below. I think it was published in Nature. So you can go ahead and read that down there. But I have read it, and I'm going to break down this claim that urban agriculture is producing 6 times the carbon footprint of conventional farming. And I'm going to look at what the study actually says, what they did, and what I think was missed. Because I do think that while this is statistically true for what they have done, it is, of course, intentionally inflammatory and without further research is very misleading to a lot of people. All right, so I took copious notes, and let's just start with the facts. This study was done by the University of Michigan, and they looked at 73 different sites in 5 different countries. Those are France, Germany, Poland, the UK, and the US. Now, right off the bat, we are looking at like very similar cultures, similar climates in these areas that were studied. And the actual title of the article here is Comparing the Carbon Footprints of Urban and Conventional Agriculture. Very straightforward, not nearly as inflammatory as this article made it out to be. And so the findings of this article are really focused on comparing, as the title says, the actual carbon footprint of one style of growing versus another. And they're doing this across a single year, specifically the 2019 growing season. And what they're doing is looking at just a bunch of different factors that are contributing to the carbon footprint. Now, what sorts of factors they're considering? Let's start a list up here. They're looking at the carbon footprint of infrastructure materials. So that's things like if you've got raised beds, if you've got fencing, if you've got trellises, if you've got a greenhouse, irrigation infrastructure, all of that stuff is in this first point. And then they're also looking at the carbon footprint of fertilizers and pesticides. They are considering greenhouse gas emissions from composting, the carbon footprint and energy required for irrigation. So that is comparing like rainwater collection versus municipal water that has gone through water treatment and then has been like pumped out via some sort of energy to people. They're also looking at the carbon footprint of the transportation of the food that is produced. So if something is produced at a farm, then it's going to have to be like flown out to a place and then driven usually from there to a grocery store. And the amount of transportation required based on what exactly you're growing is going to vary pretty substantially. And then to compare urban agriculture to conventional agriculture, they further broke that down into 3 types of urban agriculture. They have urban farming, which is like somebody in a city who has like a little farm that they are using to produce food to sell. They have individual gardeners, which would be like me. I am an individual gardener. And then they also looked at community gardens, which are places that people come to like collectively work on a garden space. Okay, so the results. The number of 6 times more carbon footprint is true if you take all of everything over here in urban farming and compare it to conventional farming here. This collectively is going to be 6 times more carbon output per serving of fruits and vegetables than conventional, considering all the factors that we listed up here. However, there are a bunch of caveats, and I think the main title really misses the nuances of all the different things that have to be considered when you are making a decision on that single statistic. Well, the carbon footprint of conventional farming is relatively consistent. The carbon footprint of all these different types of urban agriculture it varied pretty widely. And different types of urban farming or agriculture really had varying impacts on the carbon footprint. And actually, let's see, 43% of urban farms in this study, remember there were only 73 total sites looked at, 43% of the urban farms outperformed conventional agriculture. And then 25% of individual gardens outperformed conventional agriculture on the carbon footprint metric. Interestingly, community gardens were kind of the worst as far as their carbon footprint. And the authors of the study think that this is probably because of high infrastructure costs and really high turnover rates of infrastructure, the impermanence of not just the infrastructure as far as how long they can be there according to the city, but also the impermanence of the people coming in and managing it and the care of that infrastructure and all of these sorts of factors. So taking the fact that there was a fair bit of these urban agriculture sites that were outperforming conventional agriculture, they really wanted to dive into what was making these sites have lower carbon footprints. And they came up with a list of recommendations for reducing the carbon footprint of your urban agriculture setup. The first and the biggest thing that they talk about is your infrastructure. So buying a lot of short-term use infrastructure is going to have a much higher carbon footprint than buying as little as possible of a very long-lasting material. Raised beds are a really good example of this. When you are buying a material like wood that only lasts for 2 years, or unless you're buying cedar, you can actually stretch that quite a bit. But a lot of people will buy wood that is not cedar, and that will rot within a couple years, and that will need replacement. The beds that I use are a galvanized steel with a coating, and those are supposed to last 20 or more years. And so when you're calculating the carbon footprint of the produce that you're growing, you can say, okay, it costs this much carbon to grow a tomato, but if you are spreading the cost of that raised bed over 2 years versus spreading that out over 20 years, then the amount of carbon from that raised bed contributing to the carbon cost of that tomato is going to be lower if you have infrastructure that lasts longer. And if you can go without certain infrastructure, then you're going to be doing even better. A lot of my gardening is in-ground. I do some raised bed gardening as well for myself as far as testing out different ways of doing things, but also to sort of illustrate to you all the different types of ways you can do things. And I know that there are limitations for people as far as being able to bend over and work in the ground, or even working with children sometimes, raised beds, and having a contained space can just be a better idea for you. But if you can get away without the raised beds and without that specific amount of infrastructure, then you're going to have a lower carbon footprint. Another thing that you can do that is extremely helpful is to use a reclaimed material or discarded construction materials. These have already been made and they are going to go in the trash. And so if you take them, instead of them going into the trash, into using them to produce food, then that is a very low carbon footprint for your infrastructure. The next thing that they looked at is the greenhouse emissions of composting. Now, composting in general is not that high in carbon emissions, but it is very easy to mismanage your compost and end up with a lot of especially methane emissions. And when you have a bunch of people who aren't trained in composting, then you do end up with a lot of this, and that contributes to the carbon footprint of some of these urban gardens being a little bit higher than, say, conventional agriculture. And then if you look at using compost as soil amendment versus fertilizer, What they found in the study was that urban agriculture studied used on average 95% less synthetic fertilizer than conventional agriculture. However, urban farms, the ones who are producing for food to sell, used 3 to 5 times the average amount of all of the urban agriculture sites that they looked at. And then the authors get into water consumption, whether it is rainwater recycling or from a municipal wastewater treatment and pumping system. Obviously, collecting rainwater and using that for irrigation locally is going to be a lot more carbon efficient than using water that has been treated and then pumped to you from the city. And then the last thing they talked about that actually really surprised me was they considered social benefits of urban farming, urban agriculture in general. So when they're looking at the carbon footprint of conventional agriculture, they did not consider social benefits because it is like a business, and like the thing that this exists for is to grow as much food as possible as efficiently as possible. Whereas in urban spaces, we're often combining things like, is it pretty? Does it make me happy? Is it getting me outside and improving my health? And so you can actually look at these factors and see that it is contributing to a reduced carbon footprint in other areas. So they referenced a study that showed that certain elements of gardens give you better well-being with yourself, and can, I don't know how they measured it, but they found that there was reduced hospital visits involved, which of course is going to be a lower strain on the entire healthcare system, but also hospital visits and all of that is going to increase carbon footprints. And then there's like the economic value of this versus that. Gardening and growing food, especially in urban environments, is largely a hobby. And if you're doing this hobby versus that hobby, or you're doing this thing that makes you happy versus something else you could be doing that makes you happy, then gardening and growing food is one of the lower carbon footprint things that you could be choosing. Okay, and just for fun, I did a little bit of math and I looked at how much it would cost me to drive to and from my grocery store based on like the carbon emissions of my car, and also compared that to the carbon emissions of a serving of fruits and vegetables from the urban agriculture side of things. So the conservative low estimate of driving a car is about 300 grams of CO2 emissions per mile. I saw some that were higher, but I went with a little bit lower estimate to make it fair. And my grocery store is about 5 miles away, so that's 10 miles round trip, which comes out to 3,000 grams of CO2 emissions per grocery trip. Whereas a serving of food produced via urban agriculture on average across all of these sites was 200 grams CO2 emissions. So one trip to the grocery store, as far as emissions, equals 15 servings of food produced this way. Do with that what you will, but I just think knowing that sort of thing is very interesting. Now, the more interesting thing to talk about for me is what I think is actually missing from this conversation, not just with people in general, but with like inside the study itself with the authors, what they are leaving out. And I think when you're doing studies like this, I do understand it's impossible to consider everything. I mean, the fact that this study is as comprehensive as it is and takes into account as many sites as it does is actually really good compared to some of the other stuff we have out there. But, you know, there's always going to be more moving parts. And so coming to like a definitive answer on something based on a study like this, I think is not wise to do. I think you can take this information and build on it and it will be useful to you, but you have to consider the larger world that we live in, and you have to consider your own individual situation. So as I said, this study was done just over the course of 2019. And as we all know, in 2020, home gardens, urban agriculture really exploded. And so the environment of urban agriculture looks a lot different today than it did in 2019 when they were doing this study. And I think that that's really important to consider. I'm not entirely sure how different it would be, but it is most certainly different. And then again, if we go back to where this study was conducted, we've got France, Germany, Poland, the UK, and the US. And the study authors do note that this is a limitation of what they've done. It is, a bunch of very similar culturally countries, similar compared to like the entire world. And they're also very similar environments. Most of the US especially that they looked at were more northern farms. And so something like what I'm doing here in the South, there's so many more warm weather stuff that I can grow. I can also grow a lot more during the winter than somebody up north could. And so these factors are going to be very, they're going to contribute a lot to the actual carbon footprint of the garden, because my spot of land is producing more food per year than somebody up north because I can grow for more days out of the season. Another thing the authors do mention as a limitation of their own work is the aspect of land allocation. If you're looking in a city and you're saying, okay, this land is allocated for gardening, or it is a building, or it is a conventional lawn, right? They didn't compare any of that sort of carbon footprint or, in my opinion, more large environmental impact, which leads into my next point of what I think is really missing. Potentially the biggest thing that's missing from this entire conversation is the overarching long-term environmental impact of these different types of growing food. Conventional agriculture has some very well-known, very detrimental, environmental impacts, especially when you consider the monoculturing and when you consider all of the different synthetic fertilizers and the use of pesticides and how that affects the surrounding environment and the biodiversity of the environment. All of these things are going to be long-term impacts that may not necessarily be related to carbon footprints. Similarly, this study doesn't go into anything about seeds, where you're getting your seeds from, and what type of seeds they are. So when you're looking at heirloom versus hybrid versus GMO seeds, you can not only look at the carbon footprint of each of these different types of seeds, but you can also look at the difference between buying seeds every year and saving your own seeds on site, and whether or not it's more carbon efficient to grow your own seeds year over year versus buying them from a big grower who does this professionally. Definitely, if you're using GMO or hybrid seeds, you generally have to buy those every year, unless you have your own lab, which I doubt many people do. So these things I think should also be considered when you're looking at the carbon footprint of these two different strategies. Okay, wrapping up my thoughts on this. I think it is valuable that this topic is brought up, because I think a lot of people will just blanket assume that growing a garden at home is better than buying produce at the store. And what does better mean? Like I just said, there's so many factors. Nutritional value also was not discussed in this study. But if you're wanting to grow a garden, I think you should just grow the garden. I don't think that this sort of thing should discourage you from that, especially if you're trying to be environmentally conscious. But I do think that it brings to light some of the factors that we might not consider when we're saying, okay, we're going to grow a garden. Growing a garden and trying to be environmentally conscious about it is not just, okay, I'm going to grow my own food versus buying from the store. It is paying attention to your consumption of everything related to the garden, your consumption of potting soil, your consumption of building materials, your consumption of water. All of these things need to be taken into consideration, and different circumstances. I know not everybody can make big changes in the environmentally friendly direction, and growing your own garden, I think, is going to be better than just always buying all your produce from the store, if you look at everything holistically. But I think it's just so important to be aware and not just blindly consume all of these other things for a garden that you're growing, as opposed to consuming from the grocery store, because they're two different types of consumption, but they're still feeding into the industries that are polluting the world. So with that in mind, gosh, this has turned into just a huge ramble, but keeping these things in mind is very useful, I think. And I definitely don't want to bash on the authors for bringing this point up and illustrating in the best way that they can how these differences are shaping up. I think that's everything I have to say on the issue. Let me know what your thoughts are. Go ahead and read the article I've linked below, and let's make this a whole discussion. I really want to hear from the minds of other gardeners, other people who are growing in this urban agriculture type site that they studied. What are you guys doing? What are you considering? And do you think that this sort of study is valuable to people like us? Thank you guys so much for listening to this entire rant, if you're still here. I hope you found it valuable, and I will see you very soon. But until next time, as always, happy gardening.